There are more than 344,000 clinical trials in the United States and in more than 20 other countries. These clinical trials are all different, of course, but they have one goal in common: to be as productive as they can possibly be. Welcome to episode 4 of CTO, the Clinical Trials Optimization Podcast. CTO is a twice-monthly podcast that brings together clinical research stakeholders to exchange ideas, share knowledge, and think creatively about how to oversee, manage, and optimize clinical trial planning and execution. The podcast includes discussions with clinical research industry thought leaders and practitioners about how the industry is transforming clinical research design and operations to speed up the delivery of life-changing therapies. I'm your host, Linda Sullivan, and I want to thank you for joining me on this exciting journey to raise the bar on clinical trials and provide an interactive forum for discussing what we do professionally every day of our lives. We hope you'll subscribe to CTO on your favorite podcast platform so you'll automatically get every episode in your feed for free. In this episode, we'll be talking about the automation of clinical systems and risk-based quality management. And we have just the two people you need to hear from on these issues. So let me introduce them to you. First, let's meet Duncan Hall, founder and CEO of Triumph Research Intelligence, also known as TRI. Duncan has more than 25 years of experience as an independent consultant in the life sciences industry. During that time, his core focus has been on business process optimization and the implementation of clinical systems to automate and drive efficiency in clinical trials. Duncan founded TRI in 2013 to specifically focus on the challenges of RBQM adoption and has built an organization which specializes in making RBQM simple and accessible for all organizations, no matter how large or small. Welcome to CTO, Duncan.
Thank you, Linda. Pleasure to be here.
And now I want to bring in his colleague, Rachel Oakley. Rachel is VP of RBQM Services at TRI. Rachel has worked in the clinical research industry for 18 years. Starting her career as a clinical trial administrator, she has served in multiple roles in clinical operations, with 5 years spent in the functional service provision sector. Since 2015, Rachel has worked in RBQM, including creating processes, roles, and selecting technology to support risk assessment and central monitoring. Rachel's focus is on making RBQM as simple and effective as possible and to work with companies to understand how to operationalize RBQM in their day-to-day conduct of their business. Welcome to CTO, Rachel.
Thank you very much, Linda. Pleasure to be here.
I've known the two of you for quite a while, so I thank you for joining us and look forward to our conversation. Duncan, let's start off. Why did you start your company? Why did you start TRI? I mean, you did it in 2013, which is obviously before ICHE6R2 came about. So you had some foresight that things were coming and organizations needed help.
Yeah, thanks, Linda. Yes, we did. And I think 2013 was the year that some of the major regulatory authorities started to really put together discussion papers. I think they were just testing the water. I think the EMA, the FDA, the MHRA all put together either white papers or general discussion papers on what they were then calling risk-based monitoring. I think we've moved away from that parlance now and focus more on risk-based quality management as the sort of umbrella statement. But what they were seeing back then in 2013 was clinical trial monitoring and quality management were becoming very routine. It was becoming a bit of a commodity. We were seeing a real kind of cookie cutter approach to the way that trials were being run and the way that quality was being managed. And those organizations were starting to sort of put thoughts out there that there's got to be a better way. Technology's marching on. We've got better access to data. A lot of data was being collected electronically. And really the view of those papers was we'd like people to start looking at this data on a much more regular basis and making conclusions as to how to monitor the study based on data rather than based on a sort of routine monitoring plan. And I think it was those papers that really made us think this makes complete sense to us. This is a huge opportunity to get out of a bit of a rut that the industry was in at the time. And we started looking around thinking, well, there must be technology out there that does this. But at the time, we were playing around with CTMS technology, EDC, ETMF, the kind of the big hitting clinical systems and helping companies implement those. And there was just nothing out there that really did this. And I think that the reason for that was, it's a combination of business intelligence, statistical monitoring, data visualization, operational management. It's kind of a lot of challenges rolled into one. We really found that there was nothing out there that met the need. And so we decided to have a go and do it ourselves, and managed to get a bit of money together, and TRI was born.
What are the services that you actually provide at this point? This show's all about how do we help organizations in planning and execution of clinical research. You want to describe a little more detail about what do you actually do with your system?
Yeah. So I mean, everybody that we talk to, every customer we work with tends to be in a different position of knowledge and understanding about what RBQM is, what it means for their company, what it means for companies that they're serving. And so we've had to develop a very broad range of services because we're dealing with such differences in understanding and maturity and capability. So we start right at the sort of beginning of our processes are all around actually helping companies understand what RBQM is, understand what the changes that have come into the regulatory guidance are with ICH E6R2, so that general awareness and training. We then help companies actually assess the way that they're running clinical trials. We look at their QMS, we sort of look at the SOPs and their operational guidance, and we will make recommendations to changes, both to help them operationally, but also to make sure that their QMS is compliant with the regulatory guidance, to give them a foundation for how they want to operate and to make sure that they're operating from a position of compliance. And then we look at bringing technology in, again, depending on what they are and what type of studies they're running. It may be some of our technology suite, or it may be all of it. And then once they're up and running with our technology, a lot of the work that we do, and this is where a big part of what Rachel gets involved in, is actually then helping companies with the design of studies, looking at how risk-based quality management is going to influence the studies, and making sure that they're supported and handheld as their capability and skills build up. Because there's no alternative in many cases than actually just supporting them once they're up and running, because central monitoring and risk-based quality management are such all-encompassing skills. We generally find the best way to get people up and running is really to help them and support them when they're looking at real study data and take them through that process. So it really is an end-to-end suite of services. And we can do as much or as little of that as needed based on the level of experience and capability of the customer we're talking to.
So what types of organizations are you working with? Are they sponsors, CROs, academic medical centers, non-for-profit organizations? Are there a particular size organization that you work with?
It's all of those, really, Linda. I mean, the guidance, obviously, the regulatory guidance applies to anyone that's running a clinical trial within the ICH framework. So any country that's adopted ICH, which is a pretty large portion of the countries that clinical research is going on now, need to be compliant. So it really is a range. I mean, some of our smallest customers are in the sort of 30 to 40 people size, and some of our largest ones are up in the 20, 25,000 people size. And again, that's on the service provision side, working with CROs, and then the actual sponsors themselves. And again, that can be med device companies, biotechs, pharmaceutical, academic research. It really, anyone that's running a clinical trial is a target for benefiting from risk-based quality management.
And are you finding that organizations have implemented these across their studies, their portfolios, or are a lot of organizations still sticking their toe in the water, testing it, and are in a pilot stage?
I think we're seeing more and more companies now that are genuinely adopting this as business as usual. There are still many that haven't adopted. I think those that do adopt tend to apply it across their portfolio. And once you've gone to the effort to make sure that you're compliant, it doesn't make much sense to have half your portfolio compliant and half of it not. We've seen a huge wave of adoption in the last 18 months. I think the FDA did a really good job last year of really pushing people and saying, the honeymoon period's over. We really are expecting you to be compliant right now. I think that really helped drive things forward. And then obviously the COVID-19 pandemic, sadly, has been another huge impetus for people to be looking at data remotely, trying to reduce time on site, and the principles of risk-based quality management really lend themselves well to optimizing the way that studies are run and reducing the risk of human-to-human contact.
Since you raised the COVID-19 pandemic, let's continue along that line of questioning. How were the customers that have your system already in place, how were they better able to handle the situation when COVID pandemic started to close down sites and monitoring versus those that didn't have it in place?
Yeah, so I think there are kind of two parts to it, to the advantage that our customers got. The first was that once the pandemic hit, the first thing that most people did was a risk assessment on their existing studies. Because fundamentally what we're having to say was, are we able to continue this study? Is it too risky to continue? Is the safety of the patients, which was the first consideration generally, and then potentially the safety of the site staff and the monitoring staff involved? Are the risks to those people too much to continue? And what the regulatory authorities did a great job of as the pandemic broke was getting guidance out very quickly to say, we accept that the world has just dramatically changed, and we expect you're going to have to make some adjustments to the way that you approach your studies. We expect you to do that in the form of a risk assessment, and show that you've thought it through properly. You've thought about what the risks are and how you're going to mitigate and manage those risks. So obviously for companies that are using our risk assessment management platform, they already had a tool in place. Hopefully they were already in the mindset of being quite critical about what they do, and thinking in that way. And then obviously anyone that's dealing with central monitoring was in a much better position to be able to review data remotely and make decisions on the entire end-to-end data set, which allowed them to be much more selective about any site monitoring that did need to be done. So rather than just saying we're going to stop doing site monitoring, it meant that we could be very selective about site monitoring. We could also consider alternative methods of monitoring. And that capability was already there at their fingertips. So it certainly has enabled them to continue running studies in some way, obviously with some changes to the way in which monitoring is being done, and in many cases in the way that actual assessments and treatment is performed, because we are trying to reduce the patients having to come to site wherever possible, especially where those sites are some hospitals where there are lots of people with that are infected by the virus who are potentially risks of transmitting to patients, and that's the last thing we want as a patient on a clinical trial to end up with the virus on top of whatever they were being treated for. So it has enabled us to be much more responsive, or it's enabled them to be much more responsive, and to have the processes and the framework already in place to do those things.
Rachel, you're working closely with your customers. What's some of the information that they had access to that they found helpful, or what were the things they were looking at most closely?
Yeah, I think when the pandemic started, a lot of them were very reliant on the guidelines and the information that the regulatory authorities were putting out into the public domain. I spoke to a couple of clients actually that had set up like a working group or target group focusing on the pandemic. What were the latest regulations? What could we be doing? How does that affect our studies and the portfolio? So I think a lot of time and resource actually went on very early on in the pandemic within some of the clients that we work with to figure out what was going on, what was the latest news, what could we do, what couldn't we do. And I think from that and gaining some kind of comfort levels, I think from what the authorities were saying, and I think also attending some of the MCC calls that you and Keith were hosting as well, I think really helped for people to then forum where they felt they could maybe speak more openly than we tend to sometimes in the industry, understand what other people have been doing or how they've been interpreting some of the guidance that has been coming out. So I think it really brought together a bit of a community actually or strengthened that original community that we've already got in our industry, because everyone was just going through this unprecedented time and wasn't completely sure, am I doing the right thing? Has anyone else interpreted this? So I think that's how a lot of them kind of handled it first of all. So it was great to hear that and see that.
Yeah, great. Great point. We got a lot of very positive feedback from holding those weekly COVID calls, and they really were an opportunity for members helping members. We weren't saying we by any means had the answers, but the more you could gather up people that were all facing the same challenges, the more really interesting information started coming out, and really good example of the industry coming together to try to solve common problem. So some of what we heard in those groups discussions was the idea that those that had access to centralized monitoring data were able to really, as Duncan alluded to, really able to do some risk assessments, deciding what studies were going to be important to move forward. We actually had a lot of discussions around how do you track missed assessments? Do you have that data in your system, et cetera? And I think it raised that whole notion of centralizing that data review to a whole new level. Did you guys find that organizations started adding data into what they were tracking in your system? Did anything change in terms of risk indicators and some of that analysis as a result?
From the standard set of KRIs that we refer to when we're starting with clients on their centralized monitoring journey, I think several of those were already in place. I know we had an MCC call a few weeks ago as well when we were talking about KRIs, but we already had KRIs such as missed endpoints, missed assessments, missing visits, etc., so that people already had that oversight, that were already working with us and had selected those KRIs. And it was very important for study teams to start to understand, okay, well, what point are we at in the study, and what assessments or endpoints or visits are being missed, and how is that going to impact our data? And then being able to bring in statistics, I think that function to go through and say, right, well, this is the data we've got now. This is what's happening for the study. We've had to drop these assessments, these visits, etc. Do we still feel that, with whatever we can gather in these next few weeks and months, is that still going to be enough for the study from a statistical point of view to prove our primary and key secondary endpoints? So I think, once people had maybe got over the initial panic, being able to go, right, okay, actually, I've got quite a bit of data already that I can have a look at and see what the status of my study is. And I think it also encouraged people to start thinking a little bit more about, well, what else can I look at remotely? What can I gather from the CRFs and, other systems such as ePros or lab reports? And actually, I think a lot of this has then started to open people's eyes to understand, actually, I've got a lot of items that I can look at remotely and understand what's happening before I even go on site or look at a set of patient notes or anything like that. And I think once people had got their head around that, so as Duncan had said, re-looking at their risk assessments, really focusing on what is absolutely critical, and then understanding, well, what have I already got access to, so I can try and see, at least if I can't physically get on site or I'm struggling to get hold of site staff because they've been moved to different departments to help manage the pandemic, what am I still going to be able to see? So I think that has maybe moved us on a lot more quickly than we were previously seeing around not just centralized monitoring from, key risk indicators or statistical analysis, but really leveraging that technology that we've had in place for quite a while now, such as our ECRF systems, such as central lab, dashboards, etc. And for people to feel a lot more comfortable knowing that actually they've already got a lot of insight before they physically step foot on that site.
Linda, one of the things that we did for a few customers actually that independently asked us to do much the same thing was for data such as protocol deviations, which is a really common thing to be tracking in a central monitoring platform, to actually code the protocol deviations that were triggered by the pandemic, as opposed to a protocol deviation that would have occurred anyway, so that we could potentially segment the data and first of all, to flag any deviations to the regulatory authorities that were driven by the pandemic and perhaps the inability of a patient to get to site or to make a visit or whatever that impact may have been. So what we were able to do with our system was to create views of the data that sort of gave you the with COVID-driven data and the without COVID-driven data, so that you didn't end up sort of masking real problems that were caused, that would have happened anyway, which obviously need to be managed as part of your central monitoring program. There was a high risk that those things would get hidden or sort of diluted by what was an expected high number of new protocol deviations that were really due to the impacts and the logistical challenges of running studies during the COVID-19 period with the lockdown in place. So by making that little tweak to the system, it did mean that we could segment that data and either include it or choose to exclude it, and make sure that we didn't end up getting lots of poor quality data or poor quality signals because of that dilution effect. That was one of the things that we did change, and again, where technology sort of really helped us to make sure that we weren't making poor decisions because of the data being impacted that way.
Well, not only that, we had a discussion in one of our COVID groups about how important understanding when there's assessment data missing, the reason why it's missing, because biostatisticians will treat it differently depending on the reason.
Yeah.
And so from a biostat standpoint, the biostats and data management folks were saying how important it is to be able to tag that. So it's nice you were able to turn around and put that in place. We're going to take a short break now so I can tell you about the upcoming MCC Clinical Trial Summit. So we'll be right back. If you've enjoyed this discussion so far, please join us at the MCC Clinical Trial Risk and Performance Management Virtual Summit, taking place September 8 through 10, 2020. We've taken our successful face-to-face summit format and completely retooled it to deliver a unique, engaging, interactive multimedia experience. Beginning on August 26th, you'll have access to pre-recorded case study presentations about quality by design and RBQM topics. Additionally, industry experts will share insights about vendor management and site oversight. Then, on September 8th, you'll move to the 3-day virtual live portion of the summit. FDA keynote speaker, Dr. Jean Melinda, Senior Policy Advisor for the Division of Clinical Compliance Evaluation in the Office of Scientific Investigations at CDER, will discuss whether adoption of QBD and RBQM approaches are improving clinical trial quality. Next, you and your other participants will gather in virtual breakout rooms to meet with the pre-recorded session speakers and engage in facilitated community discussions about various risk and performance management topics. Some participants will opt to take it to the next level, to roll up their sleeves and join a virtual working group to build a solution during the summit. Participants will prep for the working group by viewing a selection of pre-recorded presentations and gathering information prior to the live session. Topics to be explored in this format include centralized monitoring KRIs and QTLs, what do you measure and what's useful, reassessing risk during study conduct, when and why, how to define and estimate IT system benefits before selection, and what are the most important questions about vendor performance that your organization seeks to answer. Finally, those of you who participated in the summit in the past, let me reassure you that the data analytics team exercise, aka the Follow the Data Trail competition, will be run at the virtual summit. Don't miss this opportunity to participate in this unique event. It's time to meet your peers, collaborate, share ideas, and think. To register for the summit, visit www.mcc-summit.com. I want to make sure you got that. It's www.mcc-summit.com. And here's the kicker. If you subscribe to the CTO podcast, remember it's free and all you have to do is click to subscribe. You can use discount code POD15 to receive 15% off your registration fee. That's right. Just subscribe and enter the code POD15 and you'll receive a 15% discount on registration. Visit www.mcc-summit.com for details today. Welcome back. So we were talking about some of the things that, you've been addressing with your system during this COVID experience. Do you think there's some emerging lessons learned that maybe will change the way we plan and execute trials in the future?
Yes. Most definitely. I think the biggest one for me is really focusing on what really is critical, because everyone's had to do that, right? They've had to look at their study, look at their protocol, look at the situation and go, what do I really, really have to still get information wise? We're working with a client at the moment who are re-looking at one of their current studies and trying to now make that study as virtual as possible. And actually, in the pandemic, they've worked on some of their operating procedures to allow that, virtual trial to start to happen and occur. So I think for me, that's probably one of the biggest items that I've seen. Duncan, what about yourself?
I absolutely agree with what you said, Rachel. And I think a lot of people that we've spoken to have sort of said, we knew we needed to do this years ago, and we're frustrated with ourselves for not having done it sooner. And now we've had the shot in the arms to do it. I think that, to me, one of the big kind of lessons out of this is when you know that there's change coming, when you know there are risks out there, and this isn't the first pandemic that we've lived through. It's certainly been, I think, the biggest in the way that it's impacted just about everybody around the world. But we've had Ebola and swine flu and bird flu and others that could have escalated. And we've known that this risk has been out there for a long, long time, and we've really chosen to ignore it, unfortunately. And I don't know any company that we were talking to last year that was talking about risk mitigation of pandemic, virus outbreaks or restrictions on human movement. It just wasn't at the top of anyone's agenda. And I think that most companies have now realized that was a huge oversight, and this was always a risk, and are now doing the things that they should have done. And I think it's probably more luck than judgment that the regulatory guidance changes. I think those regulatory guidance changes were much more about quality and patient safety than pandemic management. But I think that the principles that Rachel's talking about of really focusing on what's important and that critical thinking is something that we should have all been doing by now. And I think it would have put us in much better shape to deal with this had we all been doing that. I think the good thing coming out of this, if there is a good thing, is that it is that shot in the arm, and that people will now start to take that quality management and critical thinking approach and be much more streamlined and efficient about the way they design and execute trials going forward.
Yeah, I think it's also opened people's eyes to technology. For example, e-consent, it's been around for a while now, but hasn't had a huge uptake. And I'll be interested to see actually within the industry whether we start to embrace some of those newer technologies, such as e-consent, such as wearable technologies. Obviously, we've been using ePro devices for a while, but actually, stepping into the realms now of bring your own devices. I know sometimes people have put resistance up, saying, oh, yes, but, for some studies where we've maybe got older patient populations, that's not applicable. Well, actually, the rise of the silver surfer on the internet has been increasing for many, many years. So, using that as an excuse is no longer viable. And I think well, I'm hoping that it should open people's eyes a bit more now to, okay, well, how can we collect some of this data? Do we really need a physical site that these patients have to come into every 3, 4, 5 weeks, or whatever your visit schedule is? I have heard of an increasing trend within the US of hiring nurses to go into patients' homes to take their bloods, etc. So I'm hoping we're going to start to see more of an embrace of newer technology, and also compounding the understanding of what, current technology that we've used for a long time now, what it's actually capable of, and what we can be doing with that as well, and leveraging that a bit more.
So before we end the show, I do want to go back to something that Duncan mentioned early in the show, and that's around sort of training. We've just had a conversation in the last few minutes about how technology's there, People are going to embrace it more. But is it a matter of just embracing technology? Technology can only get us so far, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Are you finding that people can implement the system, but as you said, they need a lot of support moving forward? It's not just a plug a system in and go.
Yeah, I think that you're absolutely right, Linda. It's not just about technology, and this is it's a different way of thinking. To Rachel's point earlier, we are trying to drive a mindset of critical thinking, of challenging, and moving away from routine and checkbox and some of the other sort of more, say, commoditized type approaches that the industry has started or was starting to take before all this. And I think one of the real challenges is that when you're making critical decisions, that there's a tension there about, is this the right decision? We can teach people to look at data. We can teach people that, red might mean high risk and green might mean low risk and all of those things. But when you're confronted with an entire study's worth of data, it's really hard to actually make the decision that's actually going to drive the way that we conduct. Do I need to contact that site or not? If I do contact them, what am I going to say? What is it the data is telling me that I think might be happening? What's the behavior we might want to challenge or change? And that's difficult to do, through training documentation. And the way that we've, have found is the most effective is to get people in front of real data and give them that hands-on experience. We work with a bunch of very smart people in this industry. It's not a lack of intelligence. I think it is just changing the mindset and giving them the confidence to make decisions based on what they're seeing. And the more you can do that, the more you can put them in that real world environment and have them look at a genuine clinical data set and identify issues and follow the sort of process through to determine what the likely cause of that issue would be and what the appropriate monitoring response to that would be. That's really what we're focusing on and creating a sort of concept of academies where you've got real world data and you're using the real systems, and that you're actually getting to land that plane for real rather than being in a flight simulator. That's what's really important. I think that's what we're trying to get people to do is to get as much of that real world experience so that when they then go on to a real study, it's not their first rodeo and they really do understand what they're looking for, what they're looking at, and have got the confidence and experience to make good quality decisions. And that really is what central monitoring is about. We can provide the technology to help you make those great decisions. We're not at the point yet where it's making all those decisions for you. We need a human being to make those, and that's a high pressure decision. We need to support companies in doing that.
Yeah, and I think we need to help them get comfortable with that as well. We've talked about the confidence piece, but also being comfortable with it. Up until now, we've been quite prescriptive. You will visit sites every 4 to 6 weeks. You will look at all of the information. You will do 100% STV. You will answer every single one of these questions on this monitoring visit report when you get back. And if you don't, there's going to be an issue. I need a comment. I need something. And where we're moving to really, and this is where the comfort level comes in as well, I think, is we're saying, well, get your study up and running, start bringing your data in, and then have a look at what that data is telling you. And then make decisions on what you're going to do based on that. So it means building that flexibility in the monitoring strategy. It means building that flexibility within your costing tool when you're thinking about your proposals and budgets. We've got to be responsive to the data that's coming in. And sometimes when I'm working with clients to get this up and running for them, they're like, right, well, if I see 3 red flags, I want to make sure that that's, absolutely leading straight to a monitoring visit on site. That has to happen. But then you have to step back and say, well, why? Those 3 red flags might not mean anything. You've now got to use your critical thinking skills. What's it flagging? Why? What's the context? What's behind that KRI? Why might it be flagging that way? Because those flags are telling you that something looks odd compared to everything else. It's not necessarily telling you that there's definitely an issue and you must, send your CRA on site immediately. So there's got to be that comfort level around it that actually in my opinion, I don't think you should apply a hugely rigid framework onto your centralized monitoring or your stats or your remote data reviews. You need to wait and see what your study data is telling you. And if you've followed your risk assessment properly, you've identified what's critical, you've understood collectively as a cross-functional team who is looking at what data, when, why, how, and truly, created an integrated monitoring plan, not just something that's focused on clinical. And then, you should have a foundation of a monitoring strategy that suits the risks of the study that you've identified. And then you have to see what data's coming in. What is it telling you? What do you need to go and do based on that data? And I think not only do we need people to have the confidence to do that data review and have those critical thinking skills, which we've talked about multiple times in some of our MCC calls, it's also having the comfort level to do that, because we are walking away from that checklist mentality, that very rigid framework, to go, well, hang on a minute, you've got to design something that you think is going to work for your trial, but then you need to wait and see what the data says. And that's really difficult for some people. But they're starting to change their mindset and being more open and comfortable with it.
It sounds like we're really accelerating our understanding of not only how to do something, but how to get people comfortable with it. So now it's time in the segment that we're calling the trio, which is a set of 3 questions that we ask every guest at the end of the podcast. So here we go. We'll start with Duncan. Here are the 3 questions. What's the biggest challenge facing the clinical trial industry? What are some of the new best innovations? And what is your top optimization takeaway?
Okay. In terms of the biggest challenge, I think it's change. I think we are, we've been trying to change for a number of years now. I think we're now having that change forced upon us. I think the ability to respond quickly and look at all impacts across an organization is a huge challenge. I think that the technologies are a standard. The way that technologies behave is that they do what they're told to do. They do what they're programmed to do. It's the people that's always the biggest challenge, and getting people to change their mindsets is much harder in my experience than implementing technology and changing business processes. So I think that for me, that's the thing that we've really got to focus on is yes, we can update processes, we can implement technology. Those things are all important, but we've got to get people to change their mindset and start to see the importance of working the way that we need to work in the future. From an innovation perspective, I'm a little bit biased, but we've been making some major changes to our platform this year, and a lot of the experience that we've gained out of the last 3 or 4 months has gone into what we're doing. We've got a really big release of the platform coming out later this year that's just going to further build on what we've already done. I think that's really exciting. We're really excited about that, and so are our customers. I think outside what we're doing, I think that the kind of concepts of academies and trying to expose people to data is going to be really important as well. And I think companies need to be a lot more innovative about the way that they engage their staff and start to deal with that change challenge. And then finally, I think in terms of optimization, I think it really goes back to what Rachel was just saying. It's about being critical. It's about challenging everything. It's about stripping protocols down to what they really need to do in order to define the experiment we're trying to conduct. What data do we need to collect to prove that the experiment has worked, and what data do we need to collect and look at in order to manage patient safety during that process. Anything that doesn't sort of fit into those 2 questions really needs to be challenged. And I think if we can think that way, we can achieve the same end result, but with just a lot less effort in the middle. And the less that we're collecting, the less we're doing, the less we are exposed to the risk of not being able to conduct studies because of lockdown and restrictions on human movement.
Great, thank you. Rachel, what do you have to add?
Same as Duncan, really. The biggest challenge is that change piece. I think for me, I work very much on an operational level with our clients. And I think some of the challenges getting people to understand how to operationalize this and how these individual jigsaw puzzle pieces of RBQM as a whole fit together and how it moves from one to the other. So I think that's one of the biggest challenges I see from an operational point of view. I think best new innovation, again, off the back of Duncan technology. We are thinking, again, from an operational point of view, like I said, e-consent, e-pro devices, wearable technology. A lot of the discussions actually in the pandemic were around, okay, I think this trial can continue to be conducted, but how do I get my drugs to the patient and back from the patient and do my drug accountability? So I think those operational pieces and technology that supports that, I think, if somebody's toiling away out there, thinking about the next new innovation to support clinical trials, I think they're going to be very successful. And I think optimization wise, it's kind of my mantra, keep it simple. I think as an industry, we can sometimes be very good at overcomplicating things, putting out overcomplicated protocols, writing operating procedure upon operating procedure. But I think actually being able to step back, think about it in simple terms, and then hopefully come up with something that's the most effective and efficient way of doing it instead of trying to overcomplicate it. That's always the way I look at processes when I'm trying to optimize something. How can I strip it back and keep it simple, but still meet everything that I need to do from a regulatory point of view?
Well, thank you very much. I've enjoyed our discussion today. So I want to thank both Duncan Hall and Rachel Oakley.
Thank you, Linda.
Thank you, Linda.
Thanks for inviting us.
I'd also like to thank our producer, Michael Levin Epstein. And finally, we want to hear from you. Rate us on iTunes. Are there topics we should be discussing? Guests we absolutely have to have on the show? Let us know by emailing us at lsullivan@metricschampion.org. This is Linda Sullivan, and we'll see you next time on CTO, the Clinical Trials Optimization Podcast.